The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. It was 1951, and the wooden benches inside the federal building in Lower Manhattan were packed shoulder to shoulder. Men in worn suits. Women in Sunday dresses they'd pressed the night before. Young boys who'd skipped school just to see him. They'd come from Harlem, from Lenox Avenue and 125th Street, riding the subway downtown in silence, because this wasn't a spectacle. This was a reckoning. And at the center of it all sat Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. He didn't look like a kingpin. He didn't look like a man who'd spent decades moving through the streets of Harlem like a ghost, unseen by the law but known by everyone who mattered. He sat in a pressed gray suit, hands folded on the table in front of him, his face smooth and unreadable. His lawyer whispered something to him. Johnson nodded once, slow, like a man who'd already seen the ending. Across the aisle, the prosecution shuffled papers. There were stacks of them. Testimonies, depositions, names and dates and dollar amounts. And at the top of the pile was a name that half the courtroom already knew. A name that had been whispered in barbershops and pool halls for weeks now, passed around like bad news. Raymond Miller. Bumpy's best friend. His partner. The man who'd eaten at his table. Who'd stood beside him when things were tight. Who'd laughed with him when Harlem still felt like theirs. And now, Raymond Miller was the star witness for the prosecution. The judge banged his gavel once. The room fell silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from obedience, the kind that comes from anger, being held in place by sheer will. The United States versus Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the judge said, his voice dry and official. Charges include racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics. Bumpy didn't flinch. Outside, the city hummed. Taxis honked. Vendors shouted. Life kept moving. But inside that courtroom, time slowed to a crawl, because everyone there knew what was about to happen. They knew that Raymond Miller was going to walk to that stand, raise his right hand, and tell the government everything. For $100,000. Raymond Miller didn't look like a traitor. He looked tired. He wore a brown suit that was a little too big for him, like he'd lost weight recently. His eyes were red-rimmed, and when he walked to the witness stand, his shoulders were hunched forward. He didn't look at Bumpy, not once. The prosecutor stood. He was a sharp-faced man in his 40s, the kind who'd built a career on putting men like Bumpy Johnson away. He smiled at Raymond like they were old friends. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice smooth. "How long have you known the defendant?" Raymond cleared his throat. His voice came out quiet. 30 years. 30 years, the prosecutor repeated, letting the number hang in the air. "And during that time, would you say you and Mr. Johnson were close?" Raymond nodded. "Yeah. Close. Would you call him a friend?" Raymond's jaw tightened. He glanced down at his hands. "I would have called him my best friend." Someone in the back row shifted. A woman let out a small breath, like she'd been punched in the stomach. Bumpy sat still as stone. The prosecutor walked closer to the stand. "Mr. Miller, can you tell the court what Mr. Johnson asked you to do in the summer of 1949? Raymond swallowed. "He asked me to help him move a shipment." "A shipment of what?" "Heroin." The word dropped into the room like a hammer. The prosecutor nodded slowly, like he was savoring it. "And did you help him?" "Yeah." "And did he pay you for this?" "He paid me. How much?" $5,000. $5,000. the prosecutor said, turning to face the jury. For one shipment. And how many shipments did you help Mr. Johnson move over the years? Raymond hesitated. I don't know. Maybe 20. Maybe more. The prosecutor let that sit. Then he turned back to Raymond. Mr. Miller, why are you testifying today? Raymond looked up. His eyes were wet. Because I got a family, and they offered me a deal. They said if I told the truth, they'd let me walk. And how much are you being compensated for your testimony? Raymond's voice dropped to almost nothing. $100,000. The courtroom erupted. Not in shouts, in murmurs, in sharp intakes of breath, in the sound of people who just had their worst suspicions confirmed. The judge banged his gavel twice, but the sound barely cut through the noise. Bumpy still didn't move. Raymond Miller had been there from the beginning, back when Harlem was a different place, back when the neighborhood was still finding its voice, still learning how to survive under the weight of Jim Crow and poverty and everything else the world threw at it. Raymond had been a kid from the same block, same hunger, same dreams of something better. They'd run together. Not in the way the prosecutor made it sound. It wasn't about crime. Not at first. It was about survival, about making sure your family ate, about protecting your corner from the people who'd take everything, if you let them. Raymond had been loyal. For decades, he'd been loyal. Through arrests and close calls and nights when the law came knocking and they had to disappear into basements and back alleys. Through good times and lean times, through everything. And now he was sitting on that stand, selling all of it for money and freedom. But if you look close, you could see something else. You could see the way his hands shook when he answered questions, the way his voice cracked when he said Bumpy's name, the way he couldn't look to his right, where Bumpy sat, because if he did, something inside him might break completely. Raymond Miller wasn't evil. He was scared. The prosecutor kept going. He walked Raymond through every job, every deal, every name and place and moment that could be used to build a case. And Raymond gave it all up. He didn't fight. He didn't hold back. He answered every question like a man who'd already made peace with what he was doing. Mr. Miller, the prosecutor said, "Did Mr. Johnson ever threaten you?" Raymond paused. "No." "Did he ever force you to participate in any of these activities?" "No." "So you did this willingly?" Raymond's voice was barely audible. "Yeah." "And now you're testifying willingly?" Raymond looked down. "Yeah." The prosecutor smiled. No further questions. The courtroom waited. Bumpy's lawyer stood. He was an older man, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had seen too many cases like this. He walked slowly to the stand, his hands behind his back. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice calm, "you said you and Mr. Johnson were best friends." Raymond nodded. "Did he ever hurt you?" "No." "Did he ever hurt your family?" "No." "Did he ever fail to pay you what he promised?" Raymond hesitated. "No." "Then why are you here?" The question hung in the air. Raymond's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the lawyer, then at the prosecutor, then down at his hands. "I told you," he finally said. "I got a family. And Mr. Johnson doesn't?" Raymond's eyes flashed. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Raymond's voice rose. "I meant I got kids. I got a wife. I got people depending on me. And they told me if I didn't testify, I was going to prison. For 20 years. Maybe more. So what was I supposed to do?" The lawyer didn't respond right away. He let the words settle. Let the courtroom hear the desperation in Raymond's voice. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. "Did they pay you before or after you agreed to testify?" Raymond's face went pale. "After. So you made the decision before you knew about the money?" Yeah. I guess." The lawyer nodded. No further questions. He walked back to his seat. Raymond sat there, trembling, his face red. The judge called for a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, people filing out into the hallway where they could finally speak. But Bumpy didn't move. He stayed in his seat, hands still folded, eyes fixed on nothing. The trial went on for weeks. 62 witnesses. 62 people who'd seen something, heard something, knew something. Some of them were cops. Some were informants. Some were people from the neighborhood who'd been picked up on other charges and offered deals. But none of them mattered as much as Raymond, because Raymond was the one who'd been there. Raymond was the one who could connect every piece of the prosecution's case. Raymond was the foundation. And every time he took the stand, Bumpy sat and watched him. Never with anger, never with hate, just with a kind of quiet sadness that settled over the courtroom like smoke. On the final day, after the jury had deliberated for 6 hours, they returned with a verdict. Guilty. The courtroom didn't gasp. It just exhaled, a long, slow breath that felt like the end of something. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later. Bumpy was let out in handcuffs. The crowd stood as he passed, not out of celebration, out of respect, because whatever he'd done, whatever laws he'd broken, he was still Bumpy Johnson. And in Harlem, that name meant something. Raymond Miller didn't stay for the verdict. He left after his testimony ended, took his money, moved his family out of the city. Some people said he went to Philadelphia. Some said farther. It didn't matter. He was gone. But the story didn't end there. 2 months after the trial, Raymond Miller walked into a church. It was a Sunday morning. The pews were full. The choir was singing. He sat in the back, alone, his head bowed. When the service ended, he stayed. Sat there while everyone else filed out. The pastor noticed him, walked over, asked if he was all right. Raymond didn't answer right away. He just stared at the cross above the altar. "I thought I was saving my family," he finally said. "But I don't think they'll ever forgive me. I don't think I'll ever forgive myself." The pastor didn't offer easy comfort. He just sat beside him. Let him sit with the weight. "Some choices don't have good endings," the pastor said. "They just have endings." Raymond nodded. He stood. He left, and no one in that church ever saw him again. Bumpy Johnson served 15 years. When he was released, Harlem had changed. The streets were different. The people were different. But when he walked down Lenox Avenue for the first time, people still nodded, still stepped aside, still remembered. He never spoke about Raymond Miller, not in public, not in private. When someone asked him once, years later, if he hated the man who'd betrayed him, Bumpy just shook his head. "Hate's too easy," he said. "Raymond made a choice. I made mine. That's all there is." The story of Raymond Miller and Bumpy Johnson isn't about loyalty or betrayal. It's not about who was right or wrong. It's about what happens when fear meets desperation, when the weight of protecting the people you love crushes the part of you that knows what's right. Raymond saved his family, but he lost himself. Bumpy went to prison, but he kept his name. And in the end, neither of them won. They just carried the weight of their choices until the weight became who they were. That courtroom in 1951 wasn't about justice. It was about survival. About two men who'd walked the same streets, shared the same struggles, and ended up on opposite sides of a line they never meant to cross. 62 witnesses told the truth. But only one of them will be remembered. Not because he was the worst, but because he was the closest. And sometimes, the hardest betrayals aren't the ones that come from strangers. They're the ones that come from the people who sat at your table, who knew your name, who called you friend. Raymond Miller walked free, but freedom isn't always freedom. Not when you're carrying the ghost of what you did to get there. Bumpy Johnson served his time. And when he came home, Harlem was still there. Changed, but still there. Still his. Because some names don't fade. They just settle into the cracks of the pavement and wait. And in those courtroom benches and those whispers passed down through barbershops and stoops and Sunday dinners, the story stayed alive. Not as a lesson, just as a memory. Of a man who stood still while the world turned on him. Of a man who broke under the weight of protecting what he loved. Of a city that watched them both and carried the story forward, not because it had an answer, but because some stories don't need one. They just need to be told.